Okay, welcome to the 12th FAIRmat tutorial. My name is Markus Scheidgen, and I'm giving this tutorial together with Lauri Himanen. But of course, there are more people involved in this, right? So we have the whole organizational team in the background, and also developers and co-workers at FAIRmat. They basically contributed to NOMAD itself, and then eventually also to the content of this tutorial. So this is not the first tutorial of this nature, right? So it's already tutorial number 12. So we had lots of introductory tutorials where the focus was more on the use case where you just want to publish data, especially when you were coming from the computational material science background. And since then, NOMAD has evolved quite a bit. And today we want to focus on a different use case. Today we want to focus on the idea that you might want to run this for your group, for your institute. And you want to manage all kinds of data, not just computational material science stuff. So you will encounter data types that are not supported by NOMAD. Maybe you have your own data types, you have your own types of workflows, or whatever things that you run at home. And we want to focus a little bit on that, right? What do you do if your data is not supported in NOMAD? And we want to introduce a little bit to, I don't know, how does NOMAD do the data processing? What are metadata? What are schemas and these kind of things? So the agenda for today will look like this. First, I will give an introductory talk covering a little bit what is NOMAD, what is NOMAD OASIS, what are the main concepts behind it when it comes to data processing and so on. And then the bulk of the tutorial will be Lauri giving a demo that you can follow, right? So we prepared everything on the NOMAD website, and then there will be a Jupyter notebook that you can follow. And we go through all the steps from showing you some data and then building a parser for this data, building a schema for this data, process the data, do some visualization, all these kind of things that are typically associated with data management. At some point in Lauri's part, he will probably say, "Oh, let's do a small break. We don't really want to run the whole time slot continuously, but we will decide on this dynamically, right? The minutes here are more or less just placeholders, so to speak." We will give you a chance to interact, right? To ask us questions and stuff like this. But in the meantime, while we are talking, you can still use the chat and put questions there. And then when we get to it, we will answer them, of course. And then there's another thing that we are basically introducing today, and this is that we have a Discord server now running, and a part of the FAIRmat team is there and could also discuss with you there, answer questions to you. You can also mingle with the rest of the community and so on. So if you want to, here are a couple of links. One of them is the Discord server. You also find them on the main NOMAD homepage. And yeah, Ahmed also put the links into the chat if you wanna go there. But we will later on tell you exactly where you need to go if you wanna follow the tutorial. Okay, that's the administrative part. And now I'd like to start with my talk. So what is this about? First, I want to talk a little bit about where we are coming from. What is NFDI? What is FAIRmat? What is NOMAD exactly? And then I want to present briefly our products, NOMAD and NOMAD OASIS. And then we look into the details, right? In NOMAD, everything is about structured data and data schemas. So we will talk about this. And then also you see it, NOMAD OASIS, there are two products, somehow they interact with each other. So we are thinking about this distributed, expandable data structure, data infrastructure. And I want to talk about this also. Okay, let's start with with the money, so to speak, right? So what is the project structure? How are we financed and so on? So most of you are probably aware there is this thing called NFDI, the Nationale Forschungsdateninfrastruktur, like loosely translated National Research Data Infrastructure, which is a German initiative. Basically a pot of money that is distributed by the DFG. And the idea here is that the different disciplines in science should build their own data infrastructure. So the NFDI asked the scientific community to build consortia that represent certain parts of science, right? And FAIRmat is basically the consortia for material science, the physics of solids and stuff like this. So we are one of the NFDI consortia, and as such, we are a project. We are like 20 to 30 employees, depending on how you count them, that are working on building a data infrastructure for material science. And the tool that we built to do this data infrastructure, to do the research data management, is called NOMAD. NOMAD is a web-based service and the software. So you can use the service online, publish your data there, or you can use the NOMAD software to run your own NOMAD and manage your research data at home. So this is the constellation. So when you hear about FAIRmat and NOMAD, this is like the interaction between the two terms. One is the project, and the other thing is the actual tool, the actual product that we are building. A little bit details on how FAIRmat is structured. So FAIRmat as a project, because we are so many people, right? It's organized in different areas. And basically there are areas that dealing with domain-specific things. So there's an area that deals about material synthesis. There's an area for experiments with materials. There's an area about computational material science. There's an area about use cases where we try to put everything together. And then there's an area where we build the actual infrastructure. And then, of course, there are areas for training, outreach, coordination, and these kind of things. And Laurie and me, we are basically coming from the infrastructure department, so to speak, right, where we built NOMAD, and then NOMAD in turn is used by the other areas. So people in these areas, they're basically concerned about like, how can we use NOMAD for synthesis? Like, what kind of data formats do we need to support? How do we build in these kind of workflows? How do we make NOMAD talk to instruments and so on and so forth? Right? So this is what's happening in these kind of topic areas. And then here on the right, you see the overall idea of this kind of distributed architecture, right? So we basically build two things. One is NOMAD. NOMAD is a central service that is publicly available to everyone, where you can go look at data that others have uploaded, where you can upload your own data. But then you can also use the same software, and then this is what we call NOMAD OASIS. So you can install NOMAD in your institute, in your university, and for your group. You can connect then NOMAD to the various things that you have at home, like HPC clusters or certain instruments or other kind of infrastructure that you have. You can customize NOMAD with plugins and so on. You can set it up in a way that it suits your workflow. You can work in private, you can work based on your own rules, and so on and so forth. But the idea, of course, is that these kind of installations that are connected, and that at some point, if you want and have some information, data that you want to publish, that you can do this through the central service. So that's the overall idea. Okay, let's look a little bit at the values, the goals that we are following here. Although this is also something that is set up by the NFDI, right? So there's a few core ideas behind this whole thing. The first thing is that data is supposed to be fair, right? It's supposed to be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, right? And we at FAIRmat, we think, okay, yeah, that's obviously true, and we want to apply this to condensed matter physics, right? And the chemical physics of solids. Because we really believe, like, with these principles, and if everybody would participate and treat their data like this, that this could really transform like how science is done. The other core idea is that we want to build open things, right? So whatever we build should be open, and open here means like several things, right? First of all, it's supposed to be open source so that everybody can use the software that we are producing, but it also should be supposed to be open services that everybody can use and that are free of charge. But also it needs to be an open process to the community, right? When you want to participate and you say, okay, I want to shape NOMAD in a certain way, or I think for material science we need this and that, we also want to be open to this. And then the last core idea is bottom up, right? So there are basically two ways of thinking when you address research data management. First, you can say, okay, we do it top down. We just define a data format that everybody has to use, and then we try and make people use it. And then there's the other approach where you acknowledge that already a lot of stuff exists, right? There's lots of tools out there, there's lots of data formats out there, and so on. And so this is basically what we are following, right? We want to acknowledge lots of data already exist in a certain shape and form, and our platform has to be adapted, right? So we try to be flexible, and we really try to build a tool that allows you, the scientist, to deal with whatever data you have, even though that might be a little bit more work than just following an existing standard. Okay, so these are the fundamental ideas behind FAIRmat, but also then behind our software here. So now let's have a look at the typical situation, like when we talk about research data management. What are we managing here? What does research data typically look like, especially in our field? And very often we find lots of artifacts, especially when you look at experimental work or synthesis work. You find lots of manually written artifacts. Maybe they are not even digital, right? Lab notebooks, like old school, written on paper. Or even if you have digitized them, very often you're still dealing with very unstructured data because you digitize them in a way where you're just using Word or note-keeping tools. Even most super popular ELNs out there are basically just pages where you write text, right? Or where you take notes, basically without an inherent structure. Or even if there is some structure, it might only make sense to you. It might not make sense to your colleagues, or it might not make sense to a computer because the structure is so loose and not really well defined. Or you have other formats like Excel, which is a little bit more structured, right? You have rows and columns and stuff like this. But still, if you ever tried to take a manually written Excel table and do something with it with Python or whatever, some data analysis, you know how much of a pain it can be if the units are not applied correctly, right? Or if like sometimes there is a percentage sign, sometimes not, and so on. And then, of course, we are dealing with computer simulations. We're dealing with instrument software and all kinds of things that produces lots of stuff that is very old school. ASCII files with neat little ASCII arts in them. And then you have tables that are formatted like this. And then if you want to analyze these kind of data or visualize them or do something with it, you have to parse it, right? You really have to build custom tools to figure out where the numbers are and so on. And all this kind of work, right? If you want to go from your nodes or from your data to something that is fair, right? That is actually reusable, findable, and so on. You need to do something, and this is basically what we want to try to provide: the tools that allow you to transform from this into something that is far more structured, where everything is like kind of well defined, where you have a schema behind all the pieces of information, and where you can then make sure that your data is acquired in a very consistent form, so that it's much easier for you to analyze your data and do something with it, but then also for others to interpret your data and do something with it. Okay, so I already said we are building this NOMAD public service, and there's also the NOMAD OASIS. This is the web page, what it looks like. In the follow along tutorial part, we will go there and then click the buttons and stuff. But you probably are aware of these web pages. And then if people actually log into NOMAD itself, they get all kinds of view. One view that people usually visit first is the search interface, where you see like lots of filter options that you can use to figure out what data already exists and what might be interesting to you. And here you already see how important it is to rigorously work with data and extract metadata and so on, because all these kind of search options that we are offering here are only possible because at some point we extracted the pieces of information that you want to search for from the files and from the data that were uploaded to NOMAD. And yeah, another thing with these kind of extracted data, we can then all build these kind of interactive dashboards, which give you like a nice visual interactive way to represent and explore the information available. And then if you look at individual database entries, then it becomes really particular or specific to what kind of data you're looking at. Here, for example, is a typical DFT calculation. And then depending on what's in the data, you see different things, right? But also all that's here shown in numbers or that is visualized in these kind of graphs was extracted at some point from raw data. And that's exactly what we want to do in this tutorial. We want to look at like a new type of raw data and figure out how can we like draw pretty pictures from it. Okay. Another thing that is characteristic for NOMAD is it's not supposed to be just about publishing your data and seeing the data of others. It's also supposed to be allowing you to work with data. And one thing that we built into our platform that we will use heavily today is the ability to run Jupyter notebooks and other containerized tools directly on our servers. So here on the left, you see the typical Jupyter notebook interface, right? And the trick here is that the Jupyters run in a way that it has access to the files that you also manage in NOMAD. So you can upload data to NOMAD, you can open your notebooks and directly interact with your files or with the stuff that was processed using NOMAD. Yeah, but the same technology can also be used to containerize all kinds of tools, right? Because in material science, we often deal with legacy tools or with like old stuff that was programmed a long time ago, but it's still very, very valid, right? If you think about like certain software that you use to evaluate your instrument data and so on. And with Jupyter Hub and these kind of technologies, we can containerize these tools and run them directly in the browser, even though there might be desktop tools or stuff like this, right? So if you set up Nomad and your Nomad OASIS correctly, you can really integrate all kinds of tools and make it much easier for your researchers to work with them, because nobody really has to install anything or deal with these kind of things. Okay, yeah, 2 more screenshots and then I'm done with the screenshots. All the entries in Nomad, they also have this kind of side to them, this what we call the structured data view, where you can see what type of information and in what hierarchy we extracted is from the raw data given. So here's another example of a DFT calculation. And this is the data that we extract from the respective input and output files that were provided to us. So all the DFT calculations have the same hierarchical structure. If you go here from left to right, it basically reads like a book. There are sections and subsections and so on. And all these different pieces are connected to each other, and then eventually in your sections you have quantities that contain the actual data, right? So for example, we have here like, okay, there's a simulation run, and in there was a system simulated, and the system consists of atoms, and these atoms have positions in the lattice, and here you then see the actual number of where the atoms are positioned and so on and so forth. And all this information is basically backed by a formal schema. So there's a description about what the position is and what unit it is supposed to appear and how we want to display it and so on. And this kind of schema information helps Nomad to display data in the right way, to prepare data for searches, to make the data available through an API that works in a structured way and so on. So this is like the one of the fundamentals behind Nomad, that we want to treat all data as structured data, where every piece of information has its exact place. Yeah, and then the last idea that we added recently to Nomad, well, not recently, but within the FAIRmat project scope, is the ELN functionality. So we basically said, okay, we have all the structured data in the system, we have the schemas and so on. Why not make the thing editable? So we basically put form fields on top of everything, which now allows you to not only parse data from raw files or whatever that you provide, but also allow human input. Like if you want to augment your files with some human input, or if you have like processes in your labs that are completely manual, you can basically take notes like this. But we want to differentiate from your typical ELN. So it's not just about note taking, like you have like these kind of text fields where you can just type stuff. But it's very much also about like acquiring data structurally, where you say, okay, I have certain fields that people need to fill, or where I have certain data formats, and so on. And then we can also combine this with parsing data. Like for example, here you see some stuff that is manually edited, but then there's also other stuff that comes from files, like this kind of chart here comes from this kind of, I don't know, process CSV file. Yeah, and so on. So this is like another big idea that we had to add to Nomad because of all the the variety that we are facing when we are going away from DFT calculations into labs, or even in computation material science when we go to other scales of computation material science. There's just so much diversity in so many file formats and so on, that basically the modus where we just said we provide a bunch of parsers and then everybody's happy doesn't really work anymore, where we need to open up the whole platform to the community and allow everyone to describe their own data types, to build their own parsers and so on. And this is what we then in the remainder of the tutorial want to go through. But before we go there, I have a few more theoretical background information just to get a better understanding how Nomad works internally. So the first thing to look at is like how Nomad processes data. Like as I said, like you upload files, like everything in Nomad is kind of file based. Even if you use the ELN functionality, you're basically just editing a JSON file on our server. So all the data comes in files. So we might talk about the output of computer simulations. We might talk about like some instrument data and so on. So you basically use NOMAD like Dropbox, right? You put your files there, but this is then not the end of the story. Then NOMAD looks at these files and tries to do something with it, try to extract information from them. And this is then where we go into the next kind of representations of data, right? So we take the raw files and whatever it is, an XML file, an ASCII file, a binary file, an HDF file, whatever. If there is some processing NOMAD that supports this file format, it will look at the file, extract the information, and put it into a structured form. And this structured form then depends on the type of data, right? It's not the same for everything. A DFT calculation needs completely different quantities from I don't know, some kind of microscopy metadata thing. So the entries look different, right? But then when you further analyze the stuff and further process and normalize the things, at the end, you might want to extract similar information. Like all of material science typically is about discovering or figuring out what the properties of certain materials are, right? So at the end, the end goal is to populate like a large database about material properties, right? And this is something that we are still working on. Like, how can we then harmonize the data in a way, and also make data interoperable in a way that no matter where the data comes from, we can somehow interpret them from the same viewpoint, right? And for example, compare simulated density of states or band structure with the one that was measured somehow. So there might be a series of data types involved where you transform or normalize from the very raw into the very abstract and high level. And all this kind of structured data, because we have this formal schema and this formal structure behind it, we can then make available through additional tools, right? Everything you see in the UI is usually based on this. And then also everything that you do with the API or when you analyze stuff and you want to visualize things and notebooks and so on, all this is then based on these kind of structured data forms. Yeah, a little bit of background towards the data model behind NOMAD. You don't really need to know everything, but it helps for the rest of the tutorial to understand the basics here a little bit. These are basically the different entities, the different things that live in the NOMAD database. The first one here on the top is like very obvious, like when you create an account, you appear as a user, right? So that's our first type of entity. And then you as a user, you can relate to certain things on NOMAD in a way. Like one thing that you probably know is like as a user, you can create an upload, right? And then you can put your files in there. So you are then the main author of this upload. But you can also have other relationships to upload. You could be invited as a co-author, you could be invited as a reviewer and stuff like this. But the very fundamental thing is you as a user can create these kind of uploads, right? And then you can put files into your uploads. This is what you see below here, right? So each upload consists of a bunch of files. And this is basically what comes from you as a user, but what you as a user determine when you use the NOMAD system, right? You create your account, you create an upload, and then you put files in there. And then on top of this is all the blue things here. This is then what NOMAD puts on top of this automatically, right? So that's the processing step, so to speak, where we look at your files, and we try to identify what we call main files, right? We try to look at we look at all our files and try to figure out, okay, what kind of file format is this? Do I know this? Is this a vast calculation or is this an experiment XYZ kind of file? So there's this kind of matching process where our algorithms basically compare all the parsers that are available with the files and try to figure out what the file is. And once we recognize the format and say, okay, this is a vast calculation or something, then we create an entry, right? So this is where the database entries in NOMAD come from. So everything that you then later on see in a search interface, for example, are these entries, right? So at some point in time, there was a file and then NOMAD said, okay, this is now an entry. And then for all these entries, we do some processing, right? We employ the respective parser, and then the parser looks at the main file contents. It might also look at other files, depending on what the parser is doing, or what type of situation you have in here. And the idea of the parser is that it produces data sections in these entries, right? So when you think about the structured data format, there's a metadata section, there's a results section, there's a data section, and the parser is supposed to populate them, and then afterwards, there's some normalizations happening. Also depends on the situation, on the file type, and so on. And the goal of the normalization is to look at the data and then maybe extract some results from the data or populate some of the metadata from it and so on. And then also prepare things for search. Yeah. But you will see more details about this in the following tutorial. But it's just that you have heard the terms at least once, right? So let me check the time. Yeah, I think I can give you a few more information. Yeah, this is what we want you to think a little bit when you approach Nomad from the research data management perspective, right? So when you go to Nomad and you have some data and then you think, okay, what do I do? Like first you try to figure out whether this is some data that Nomad already supports. And if not, you have to make certain decisions, right? So let's say you have a certain type of file that you want to manage in Nomad. Like the first question you ask yourself, is this something that Nomad already supports, right? So you could try just uploading something and see if something happens, or you can look at the list of parsers that we have. But if this is something that we support, then you're already in a good spot, right? You can just upload the data and whatever tooling we have, we try to extract as much information as possible. But there is also the high likelihood that we are not supporting what you already have. And this is then what this tutorial here is about. What do we do now? And there are certain options, right? First, everything one thing that we always need is like a schema. Someone has to tell what this data is about, what quantities appear in this type of data, how are they structured. And the first thing that you can do is you can write your own schema, right? So we have a YAML format that allows you to write down a schema, and then you can upload the schema alongside your data and use this. The problem then is like, okay, everybody's now defining their own schemas, but most of the data is somehow related or similar or whatnot, right? Shouldn't there be a way to reuse the schemas of others and so on? And this is like one possibility that we have here is that you can use base sections in your schema. Like we will learn that schemas are actually made of classes that can inherit from each other, and you can basically have abstract section definitions, and then you can have more specific ones. So you could reuse the schema of someone else and just add the stuff that is specific to you. And with this reuse, you might also inherit lots of functionality like visualizations or certain tools or whatever. Another question you often should ask yourself is like, okay, is this really data that I just have in a file, or is this data that I want humans to enter or augment in some way? So you also have the possibility when defining your schema to define an ELN to say these and these quantities I want to have form fields for, and I want to be able to edit them. Yeah, this is so basically the process. And then at the very end, when you have your schema, right, and the question is how can you convert your file into something that adheres to the schema, but that Nomad can understand. And there are several ways. Like if the data that you have is somewhat generic, if it comes, for example, in an Excel file, we have some generic parsing facility to it. Or if you are willing to transform, like if you already have a JSON file or something, you can design the schema in a way that we understand this right away. But very likely, or in very many cases, you want to build a plugin. You want to build your own parser. You want to build your own normalization routine. And then this is like the last point here, right? If nothing else works, you have to build your own thing. And we want to show you today how this in principle works and what kind of things you have to get into to actually do this. Everything that's blue here, you can basically do on the public Nomad, right? It's all available through the UI, and you can just do these kind of stuff. With the plugins, it's a little bit different. This involves some programming, and in the end, you need to run your Python code and stuff like this in the Nomad installation. And this is where we say you need an OASIS, right? Because we cannot really take arbitrary code that you provide and just run it on our servers for security reasons. There's one kind of way around it, and this is like using Jupyter notebooks, because they run in their own sandbox and there you can do whatever we want. And this kind of way around we are using later in the tutorial where Laurie will show you a notebook where we can do most of the parser writing, schema writing, and Python stuff that is involved with plugin development in a notebook, so that you don't need to set anything up, and you can basically learn this kind of stuff without getting too serious about it. Okay, now a few words about schemas. I think this is pretty clear to everyone already. When we talk about data and data schemas, we are basically talking about a hierarchy of a conceptual hierarchy of some sort. Like in the end, all the data that we acquire comes from some kind of real life phenomena, or it's like from a simulation. It's like the solution of a mathematical model or whatever. There is something that we want to represent with data, right? And then here on the data layer, we often arbitrarily separate data and metadata. And this is really from a computer's perspective, or structurally, this is like completely arbitrary. The computer doesn't really know what is data, what is metadata, and it doesn't care. For the computer, it's only important what data structures are there, what kind of data types are there, and so on. Like if you have an SQL database table or whatever, right? Whether some columns are data and some columns are metadata is really just up to the user and interpretation. It even might vary depending on who you ask, right? Whether something is considered data and metadata. So that's why they are here living on the same kind of playing field. And from the perspective of the schema, or from the perspective of processing, writing parsers and whatnot, it doesn't really make a big difference. It's more for us humans to organize the information. But typically we associate, like if you think about a microscope picture or whatever, right? We associate the pixels, like the raw numbers with data. And then everything that is about the data, like how was the picture taken, who was it, in which environment, what sample was under the thing, these kind of stuff we usually consider metadata. And for all data, no matter metadata or data, we can define schemas, right? We can say this data has this and that shape, it uses this and that unit, and it's organized in a certain way. So this is what the schemas are doing. Okay, let me jump this slide and go here. Yeah, so let's get a little bit more serious with like specific examples and actual code. You don't have to understand the pieces of the code here. I just want to give them to you conceptually. Later on when Laurie is presenting his stuff, the examples will be much smaller and simpler and easier to follow. I just wanted to show you what the schema basically looks like from a technical perspective, right? So they're also for a schema, they're different representations, so you can write down the schema. You can go to a blackboard and draw a chart like this, where you say, okay, I want to think about the composition. The composition is a formula, and it might consist of elements. And then for each element, I have a label, I have an atomic number, I don't know, certain isotopes that are typically associated with these kind of elements and so on. You can, just as an example, right? And this information you can then also, like either in a NOMAD way, you can either program it in Python. So we have some library that allows you to define this data structure, so to speak, and then we call it schema. So you can define your sections. You can define a section for elements. You can define a section for composition. This is what you see here and here, right? And then these sections contain actual quantities, actual data, like the element has label, atomic numbers, and so on, right? You can define them like this. You can say my element has a label, and the label is always of type string. So you basically defined the section with an empty box in there for the label, and then yeah, every string basically would be a valid label. Yeah, then you can think about whether this is the right way to do it. You can probably refine it and say, okay, it's not everything is a label. There's a certain enum of possible element labels. Maybe you want to do it like this. Yeah, but this is then also where the creativity and the actual development of schemas actually happens, where you have to think, what are my quantities? What is the right type for my quantities? What is the right name for my quantity? And so on. Yeah, but this is what a schema does, right? And then there are different representations to it. You can program it down like this in Python, or you write it in a YAML format, or you write it in a JSON format. In the end, it's all the same, right? Also, the schema adheres to a certain schema. Like within our schema system, we say there is something like sections, there is something like quantities, and sections can have quantities, and quantities can have names and units and types. Yeah, this kind of formal model is behind it, and here it's just implemented in Python, and here it's implemented in the YAML format. It doesn't really make a big difference conceptually. And then when you have a schema, the next step is then, okay, the schema alone is kind of worthless. You want to think about data and something that instantiates the schema, right? And this is what it would look like in Python. You can take the classes that are defined here, and you can just instantiate them. And then this process create actual data, right? You can say, okay, now I have a specific composition with a specific formula in mind, and I create this composition and call it water or something. And then it can have elements. So now to the list of elements, right? This relationship here, I want to add elements, right? I want to add the hydrogen, I want to add the oxygen, and provide some data. So this is like how you can instantiate a schema, and then the information that you have also again has various representations. You can write it down in Python like this, but you can also transform it into JSON, for example, if you want to store the data or something. Then it would look like this. But it's the same structure, the same information. It's like a composition with a formula, with elements, and so on. I think you get the point. Yeah, this is the formal model behind how the NOMAD schema works, like basically the schema language, so to speak. Yeah, there are lots of details, but I think the important things that you have to remember is that you basically, when you write a schema, you define sections, and sections then can have subsections, so they can be connected to other sections, and they can have quantities, right? And then quantities is where your actual data goes. Like if you remember these three things, sections, subsections, quantities, then you basically understand 90% of how the schema development in NOMAD works. Yeah, and then with this kind of schema system, a structured data approach in mind, you can then see where NOMAD gets its flexibility from, right? So because it's all just about little tools that take some file, extract some data, transform some data, and then put it on the UI. But this kind of data extraction and then keeping the data and then manipulating the data all happens within this kind of schema system that we call structured data, right? So on the input side, you can use the user interface to edit your ELNs, right? Or you can put up files that are in one of the 60 formats that we already support, right? Or for example, the Nexus format, or you can put your Excel and CSV files in there. You could also implement your own plugins here, your own boxes, right? So that you support more data types. On the output end, it's then the UI that shows you things, that allows you to search. It's Jupyter notebooks that using the API to access data, to do some machine learning on them and so on. Then also we have different storage backends, maybe not super interesting to you, but for us, it's very, very interesting that we can then take the structured data. And as I said, it doesn't really matter how you store and represent the information. It's just you just have to keep the structure intact, right? So you can store them as binary JSON, you can store them in a database and so on. So in fact, NOMAD basically takes all this information and stores it in several ways, depending on how you want to use it. Like some of the data ends up in the search index, other data is just stored in files on the disk. And then also on the last dimension here, how we define schemas. There's the way that I just showed you with using the NOMAD YAML format or using our Python library. But there are other ways as well. For example, we support the Nexus format, which in itself is just a bunch of formats. It has its own kind of schema language, and we understand this, right? And in the future, it's plausible that we could also extend NOMAD to other schema systems. So, for example, we are also thinking about exposing NOMAD into the semantic web world, where basically it's about converting all what we have as schemas into ontologies and terminologies and stuff like this. Okay, so that's my last slide, and then I hand over to Laurie. Again, the idea, everything is about schemas, but now people are start writing the schemas, and they might duplicate things quite a lot, right? So when we open this process to the community, there's an inherent risk that everybody creates their own standards, so to speak, or their own schemas behind their file formats, and we don't really want this. So we are thinking about ways to incentivize the people reusing existing stuff. And as you saw, every section definition is basically a class, and you can inherit this class and you can specialize it, and you can do all kinds of things. This is here represented, this inheritance relationship here with this kind of arrow with the big open box here. And then you see, okay, who's defining all the schemas? Where are they coming from? So, and a bunch of schema stuff comes from NOMAD directly. So it's part of our project. So for example, we define what an activity is, and then a simulation is an activity, and the measurement is an activity. Like these kind of concepts exist in NOMAD itself, and then NOMAD can provide certain functionality around it, right? For example, there's this workflow viewer that allows you to see how different steps in an experiment or whatever are connected. But then there are also more specialized concepts. For example, when you think about a vast simulation or a particular kind of measurement, and those we basically think about as in plugins, right? So we want to make NOMAD open and allow people to add functionality to it, and we do this through a plugin mechanism. And some of the plugins are kind of built-in core plugins that come from the FAIRmat project or from the NOMAD developers, but those plugins in principle could also come from other people. So everything that is somewhat domain-specific, that falls into one of the FAIRmat areas, is basically now designed as a plugin. And these plugins are, of course, reusing the existing classes from NOMAD to also reuse the functionality that is associated with it, right? And then the plugins bring in their own functionality and basically attach it to their schema definitions, right? So the powder diffraction schema might just define a data structure, but then based on this data structure, the plugin also provides like a visualization so that you can see a chart of the diffraction pattern or something. or there might be a notebook associated that comes with it and does certain analysis based on the data type. So the idea is like if you now think about your own powder diffraction kind of experiment, that you think, okay, oh, there's already this visualization in there, there's already this notebook associated with it. Let's reuse the plugin that already exists, and I only add my own stuff to it. Right? Maybe I have certain settings in my instrument or whatever that are just happening in my lab. So I basically take the same section that already exists, I inherit from it, and I just add a few attributes or a few quantities that cover my stuff. And in this way, we basically want to build this large hierarchy and open the system to the community and let everybody participate. And then again, you can do these things in like the NOMAD stuff, the NOMAD developers do, the plugins you can do as a plugin developer, and then you have an Oasis, you can run your own plugins and stuff. And then, but also as a normal user, you can do quite a lot by providing your YAML schemas. And in the YAML schema, you can also reuse other classes, even if they were programmed in Python or come from a plugin, whatever. Okay. Yeah. Then there's some obvious information. I think that you are pretty much aware of the concept of the Oasis, right? We have the central NOMAD. We have the idea of installing NOMAD Oasis at your lab. And the big thing about this is like when you run your own Oasis, you have certain abilities that you don't have on the central system. First of all, or most important for this tutorial here, you can run your own plugins. You can add more Python code to the NOMAD thing, more processing, more normalization, and so on. So you have full control over this. But you can also connect your Oasis to local resources, right? You can run your Jupyter notebooks on an HPC cluster if you have the right infrastructure for it, for example. Or directly interface with the storage system of your microscope array or whatever. And then, of course, the idea is that we already had this in the beginning of the presentation, that we connect everything and build this distributed network of NOMAD installations. Okay, that is it from my side. I basically talked a little bit about FAIR, open, bottom-up, like these kind of core ideas behind FAIRmat. And then I showed you a lot about how NOMAD works internally in terms of structured data and defining schemas and abstractions and so on.